At Best Actor Allu Arjun's residence there. He'll probably speak in a while from now, but those were pictures of celebrations, and he and his family have enough to celebrate today. Let's shift our focus now. This is the big international headline. Invading Crimea in 2014, waging a war against Ukraine in 2022, using lethal nerve agents to poison his enemies, and many such actions by Russian President Vladimir Putin has made him look shockingly reckless. So was last night yet another spectacle of what lies in your path if you happen to turn your back against the Russian president? The top boss of the Russian mercenary group, the Wagner army, Mr. Prigozhin, died in a plane crash last night. He was reportedly flying from Moscow to St. Petersburg on his private jet when it crashed in Russia's Tver region and killed all 10 people on board, including the warlord. Although his body has not been found yet, he has been presumed dead. I mean, pretty difficult to get out of that fire alone and alive. The Wagner Group was quick to turn to social media, accusing the Putin regime of shooting their boss's plane down. But in any case, he was seen as a dead man walking after his failed mutiny against Putin in June this year. Perhaps Prigozhin himself didn't realize the danger he invited by crossing Putin. And Russian experts are surprised as to how he was allowed to thrive for so long after scorning Putin, given how Kremlin is infamous for resorting to poisoning and gangland-style assassinations to settle their scores with anyone who challenges their hegemony. US President Joe Biden says that he's not surprised about what happened with the Wagner boss. Listen in.
First of all, it will not come as a surprise if Yevgeny Prigozhin, the boss of Wagner, has now finally been dealt with by the Russian state. It was more of a surprise that he was allowed to survive for so long after mounting this challenge to Moscow by taking his men and marching on the Kremlin, looking for a reckoning with the Ministry of Defense. However, he will have known since then that there was a target on his back, and President Putin needed to set an example. You cannot have Yevgeny Prigozhin setting a dangerous precedent by mounting a mutiny and actually surviving it.
I was asked about this by you. I said I'd be careful what I turn to what I wrote in. I don't know for a fact what happened, but I'm not surprised. There's not much that happens when Russia is not behind, but I don't know enough to know the answer. I've been working out for the last hour and a half.
Now, like President Biden, other global leaders are opening a no-holds-barred attack on Kremlin and the Russian president. Listen in to what the German foreign minister is saying.
Wir kennen dieses Muster in Russlands, in Putins Russland, Todesfälle und dubiose Selbstmorde, Fensterabstürze, die alle letztendlich unaufgeklärt bleiben. Das unterstreicht ein diktatorisches Machtsystem, das auf Gewalt gebaut ist, kennt auch nach innen und nach außen nur Gewalt.
Prigozhin wasn't always against Putin. The two come from the same city. Once a hot dog seller and a caterer for the Russian elite, he was known as Putin's chef and was considered one of his aides. His Kremlin contracts helped him scoop resources to start the Wagner army, which is known to help the Russian military with its quote-unquote dirty work, despite having no affiliation with Kremlin. In fact, Prigozhin earned the reputation of one of the cruelest commanders among those leading Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But Wagner's insurrection mutiny against the Russian military leadership began on 23rd of June this year, when he accused the Russian military of deliberately shelling his forces in Ukraine and taking away the credit of their victories with them. Although he never mentioned Mr. Putin by name, he was extremely angry with the Kremlin. And Kremlin, in turn, was extremely angry with him for criticizing their senior military leadership. He told Russians they had been deceived and that their sons were dying in the Ukrainian war due to poor leadership. Prigozhin then had relentlessly accused the Russian government of not getting enough arms and ammunition. From accusing the Russian army of not being brave enough and not getting support from the main army, Prigozhin is said to have threatened Kremlin with withdrawing troops from strategic locations in Ukraine. But first, let's listen into the man himself, Prigozhin, and what he said a couple of weeks ago.
Вот это вот парни ЧВК «Вагнер», которые погибли сегодня. Еще кровь свежая.
Of course, all of this was not going to go down well with Moscow, and experts and analysts termed this an act of setting an example. Listen into what Russian political science professor Dmitry Orkishin is saying about what happened with the warlord.
Всякому, кто что-то посмеет, на что-то покуситься, голову оторвут быстро и незамедлительно. В этом смысле Путин выбрал из разных неприятных вариантов наименее неприятный. Он показал, что ситуацию контролирует, что силовые ресурсы на его стороне, что всякий, кто посмеет, тот получит.
Vladimir Putin is notorious for not forgiving those who challenge him or cross him. The Russian president, he was also the ex-KGB agent, he's been under fire from global leaders. Here are some examples of what he has done. Alexander Litvinkov was a former Russian intelligence officer who turned a defector. In 2006, he died a slow and agonizing death in a London hospital because of poisoning. Sergei Skripal, he's a former KGB agent. He turned defector, ran off to Britain. In 2018, a fatal nerve agent, Novichok, was put on the door handle of his house in UK, where Skripal and his daughter Yulia had a narrow escape. Then there was Viktor Yushchenko. He's a former Ukrainian president who ran against Viktor Yanukovych, who is known as a Kremlin favorite as well. In 2004, Yushchenko was left permanently disfigured again because of poisoning that originated in Kremlin. Very recently, you have Alexei Navalny, Putin's strongest political opponent. He suffered a pretty similar fate. In 2020, Navalny became violently ill due to Novichok poisoning, and he was put in an induced coma for weeks at a German hospital for him to finally recover. And finally, of course, there is no confirmation coming in from the Kremlin so far, but there is an old video of Putin that has resurfaced where he's clearly saying that the one thing he cannot forgive and forget is betrayal. Listen in.
Да. Но не все.
А что невозможно простить?
Предательство.
Вы так жестко сказали о предательстве. Вас предавали в жизни?
Ну, вы знаете, я не хотел об этом говорить, но по большому счету я не могу пожаловаться на то, что я сталкивался с каким-то таким серьезным событием, которое можно было бы назвать предательством. Нет, в моей жизни такого не было.
Боялись вас просто предать?
Трудно сказать. Может быть, я выбирал таких людей, которые на это не способны.
Let me go across to Harlan Ullman, who is the chairperson of the Killowen Group. He's also a senior advisor at the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for your time here on Mirror Now, Harlan Ullman. Can I please start by asking you why you say that Putin will seek plausible deniability by blaming Ukraine at this point of time, given Mr. Putin's poisonous playbook, as it were? Will the world really believe him, even if he steps out and says, hey, I've not done this?
Well, first, you have to realize that Russian law specifies and Soviet law specifies that traitors are to be brought to justice whether or not they are at home or abroad. This goes back to the days of the Tsar. This goes back to Stalin, who had Leon Trotsky killed in 1940 in Mexico, as well as millions of other Russians. So this is not new. I think it's interesting that 2 months ago, Putin was seen on the rocks as being severely wounded and weakened. Now, everybody in Russia knows who was responsible for Prigozhin's murder. It was Putin. What Putin might do is to turn this around and blame Ukraine, or at least muddy the waters as to who was responsible. Nobody will believe that, but the Russians will. And so I think Putin has done using shock and awe to make a very, very powerful point that he is not to be reckoned with. But this is not new. When Stalin died, who was the first casualty? Lavrentiy Beria in 1953, who was head of the secret police, who was a threat to the Politburo. Then when Russian and Soviet leaders were relieved, Khrushchev in 1964, Yeltsin in 1999, and then Gorbachev, they were allowed to retire. But in this particular case, Putin has returned to the bad old days of the Tsar and the Soviet Union and administered ruthless justice. And Prigozhin learned that he's not going to mess with the emperor or the Tsar, and the Russian people understand that. This is with whom we're dealing.
But Mr. Ullman, of course, there are many experts who are saying that Prigozhin was in any case living on borrowed time, that they are surprised that it took so long. But here's my question to you. If you looked at the events of the last 3 months, one would have almost thought that Mr. Putin has forgotten, forgiven, and moved on. After all, there are enough sightings, there were enough sightings of Prigozhin moving happily between St. Petersburg and Moscow. Although we know that he had been sent into a sort of an exile in Belarus. So if he had free movement in the country, if he was hobnobbing with African leaders in the country, one would have thought he had the blessings of Mr. Putin, but clearly not.
I think that the plot, and it was a plot to kill Prigozhin, took time to administer. This was not something that was going to happen overnight, and it was carefully thought out. My guess is that they planted some kind of explosive on his airplane, probably through the GRU, which is military intelligence, or the secret intelligence services. And this was something that required time, and waiting 2 months was very much in Putin's interest, because having, as I said, recovered from being badly hurt 2 months ago when Prigozhin made his move to Moscow, he's now emerged as a supreme power in Moscow and in Russia. And so it seems to me that waiting was in his best interest. And now there's no question to the Russians who is in charge. And this, for the time being, is going to reinstate Putin as the primus inter pares in Russia. Now, what it does for the internal leadership issues remain to be seen. There may be disconnect, there may be discontent, but for the time being, this reestablishes Putin as the supreme leader. How long that will last remains to be seen. But we've now returned to the bad old days of the Soviet Union and the Stalinist instincts that killed off all enemies.
All right, Mr. Harlan Ullman, thank you very much for your perspective. It was good to have you on the show here. Thanks very much for joining us. Let's turn our focus now back